Hello, and welcome to 52 Weeks of Health Equity with Conscious by Us. I'm your host, Tahisha. On today's podcast episode, we'll be exploring the romance genre and how it has changed and evolved. At 52 Weeks, we explore stories and ideas that listeners may not associate with health equity. This is because we include the community and social perspective and its impact on societal views around health, wellness, and equity. Today, I have 4 romance authors with me. They are Danica Bloom, Lainey Davis, Karen Gray, and Dr. J. We'll be discussing how the romance genre has influenced the way we think about pleasure, sex, consent, especially regarding women, because this isn't really your mama's romance novel anymore. So without any ado, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing panel who can introduce themselves way better than I could, starting with Danica.
Hello, Tahisha. Thanks for having us. So I'm Danica Bloom, and I am a Canadian romance author, maybe perhaps having a little bit of a different kind of a perspective on health from being up here. And I write steamy romantic comedy set in either, I would say, small Canadian cities and small towns up here in Canada.
Hello, I am Lainey Davis, and I write steamy contemporary romance, and I live in Pittsburgh, and all of my books are set right here in the Steel City.
I'm so happy to be here. My name is Karen White. I am a longtime audiobook narrator and professional, and I started writing nostalgic romantic comedies as Karen Gray in 2016. My books are set in the 80s and 90s, some in Boston, some in North Carolina, and that's it.
Well, hello, everyone. I am Dr. Donna Jennings, known in the writing world as Dr. J. I am very different from these wonderful writers with me today because I'm a retired sex therapist turned erotic fiction author and editor for Rosie, a sexual wellness platform for women. I have different books out in erotica, and I have my first erotic romance called Jolted, set in a small town location about a sex educator and a pharmaceutical CEO. So it will be quite interesting and different.
Thank you, ladies. I know when I was growing up, romance novels were the kind of thing that we'd go into the bookstore, pull out certain novels, go to the steamy section to read about sex. Basically, we were reading about pleasure or how pleasure appeared for women. And looking back, there were probably some very problematic themes that we were socialized to absorb as high school girls and young women growing up. When we think about pleasure and sex today and how we may have incorporated some of those views, especially Generation X, baby boomers, maybe early millennials, what do we want to share about how today's romance novels have moved away from some of those themes or how they have evolved? And Karen, you look like you're biting at the bit.
Well, one of the reasons I write books set in the 1980s and 1990s is that many of the books written during those times are, as you said, really problematic, going so far as to equate rape with seduction. Obviously problematic, but even or besides topics of questionable consent, there are all the other societal issues that we were either unaware of or addressing in really distressing ways. But even things just like whether or not couples are choosing to use protection or how that decision happens. None of those things are addressed. And in romance novels today, they are addressed. And the other side of it to me is that generally the lack of respect and the shame that is attached to both reading and writing romance novels is really connected to the shame that is put on women and, frankly, anyone who is non-cisgendered male when it comes to your sexual life, your sexual pleasure. And so I think all of us in our writing really go at that head on.
Karen, I'm glad that you mentioned that because when I was thinking about doing a romance panel, I really thought, oh, romance writing listeners, they might consider this fluff. They might not get that, this does impact health, the connection with that. As you mentioned, there's this shame when women or anyone reads romance. It's not taken as seriously as some of the other genres. When we think about sci-fi or mystery, there's not that same sense of shame and guilt when people read those. So how do you address that bias and shift the thinking? Lainey.
Yeah, I have an MFA and I have been in graduate school at a major research institution, and there is this stigma that the genre and the people who read them are, vapid. And today in 2023, it is still like risque to write a book where women's pleasure is centered and where everything works out well for women in their careers, in their sexual endeavors. And so I like to remind people of that, that there is still something really empowering in reading a story where women are allowed to feel and experience and seek pleasure.
Dr. J.
Oh, I want to jump in there, Lainey. I am so with you on that point. And I think, for me, taking a look at this, I wanted to talk about how romance books teach sex education, whether the reader knows it or whether the author intended it. And this idea came directly from my therapy and education when I asked people, how did you learn about sex? And I think, while most folks do not receive formal sex education, it makes it even harder for authors who do a spectacular job of doing research. But this enlightened group goes even further. They're going into the depths of what are these different content points that we need to think about. And let me be a sex nerd for a minute, because I use sex research as a component for the writing that I do. And we know that when women read those sexy bits, those little steamy parts in the book, that they experience desire, arousal, lubrication, and orgasm, now shown in research. So I think, to create sex positive works that highlight so many different things, but also for me to help other authors understand that there's more levels, more depths, more things that they can talk about, but they need to do that sex education with them so that their readers get to appreciate it through the story and the characters that they're telling.
Dr. J, thanks for highlighting that. And this might be TMI, but I often felt guilty when I would read something and feel physically excited. Knowing that's completely normal for a woman to experience that type of pleasure is so empowering. I'm glad that you're able to share that with our audience. One of the things that's been mentioned is how you all are teaching about sex ed and how to engage in pleasurable, safe sex. What I remember from those old romance stories was they didn't talk consent. They didn't talk about contraceptives. They actually didn't talk about personal pleasure. So when I started to engage in sex, I didn't even know how to bring those topics up. Because even though I had sex ed in school, it was very clinical and more about anatomy than how to actually have pleasurable, safe sex. A lot of my knowledge around how to have sex came from reading fiction, particularly romances. So I love the idea of writing romance, understanding the responsibility writers may have to educate readers about healthy sex and discussing what used to be taboo.
I think it's normalizing those conversations too. And again, bringing it back to shame, if we in our writing can make these conversations part of the sexual experience, but also center a person's sexual exploration and, as Lainey said, sexual pleasure and sexual relationships with their own personal growth. I think that's what a lot of us try to do in our writing. To have a story that has an arc, that has characters who grow, that is a compelling story. They have to face their demons. They have to face their fears. And I think really good, steamy romance writing puts that in the sexual scenes. So it's not just love scene, sex, or other, personal growth, sex. It's all intertwined together, and that both characters or maybe there's 3 or 4 who are in a love relationship, learn through that intimacy about themselves, about being in relationship, about love, so that it's not a separate thing from your life, that sexual pleasure and sexual relationships are part of your personhood. And again, just normalizing that, making it all part of our stories.
Love the theme of normalizing that. Danica.
Yeah, I kind of jumping on your TMI and also the idea of shame and normalizing. Before I started, so I'm late to the romance genre. I only started reading it in my 50s. And because in my house, I was in that house where romance was not read. We read encyclopedias and we read nonfiction, and romance was seen, it wasn't just that it was less than, it was taboo, as was sex. So I grew up with a lot of shame around sex, such that I never could speak about it. And it had terrible impacts on my first marriage, such that the marriage ended, and it was because of sex. I encouraged my first husband to have an affair because I was so incapable of talking about my lack of interest in sex. Like it was that bad. So in my 50s, I began writing other genres. The only writing community was a romance writing community. So that's how I actually came to engage with romance authors, who I think are the most freaking fabulous people on the planet. And then ultimately started writing it. Before because my background was more nonfiction, or was nonfiction, I started writing a book that I had titled Girls Who Get Themselves in Trouble, The Unholy Communion of Sex, Religion, and Politics. And I spent 2 years researching this and doing all kinds of work, and realized I am going to be preaching to the people who already are willing to hear this message. The only way that I'm going to actually accomplish what I hope to accomplish with normalizing sex and conversations about sex and being allowed to talk about pleasure and all of the influences that we have that are external to us that we don't even see, is to actually do something that is gen pop. Romance is really a subversive way to get those conversations going. And so I totally changed tack, and honestly, I couldn't be happier. Romance just feels like such a joyful thing, steamy romance in particular. And the way Dr. J talks about, I love, we don't write sex scenes if you're doing it with a holistic approach. You're writing scenes with sex because the sex starts from the very beginning. And I will let Dr. J talk on that one, but it feels subliminal, and it feels activist, and it feels really empowering to both me and my own sexual identity, and also to being helpful.
I love the word subversive, right? Because subverting the popular culture around romance, sex, and how women approach sex is very powerful. Women are often not seen as sexual creatures with desires, and thinking about romance in a new way says, hey, sexual pleasure is empowerment, is a whole new way to think about the romance genre. When you think about the current generation, how friendly are they to the idea of reading romance, or think of it as cutting edge and empowering? And Lainey, I see you.
Yeah. I have been at this for about 6 years now, and I have been thrilled in the way that readership is demanding more from us. I do think the readers are getting younger, at least readers who are finding us via social media. And I can, as an example, in the years since I've been writing, it used to be kind of common for the love interests to have a conversation about STI, and maybe one of the characters would say, I'm clean. And that lingo now is really frowned upon and rightfully called out by readers who, don't want STI to be associated with being dirty, or any aspect of sex. So I really appreciate what I view as a younger and more demanding, in a great way, audience who is asking for the change that they want to see in our books.
So you mentioned STIs. And so I want to touch on that a minute, because they are an issue when it comes to healthcare and like maybe having some health equity in the female space. So how do you approach that from a meaningful but encouraging way? Are there discussions about STIs still in the romance genre, or is it just how do you talk about it in a way that is empowering?
So I have not yet written a character who has an STI, but I do make sure all of my characters discuss, like they have a conversation before they are physically intimate about their sexual health. My work in progress right now, I actually have them going to get tested together. And so I enjoy the challenge of learning, the challenge of finding ways to make that sexy and keep it, open and on the page. And Dr. J has led some workshops about this type of writing, like keeping that present. And I'm sure she has ideas right now.
Dr. J, I would
I'll
love
just
to
hop
hear
right
about
in with
that.
those
Yeah.
ideas, Lainey. Woo! So, what's interesting is that when you think about, I think writers, all of us here are in a perfect position to say we're interested in investigation. We want to rise the information to help readers get good information and approach them and get information that they need. But one of the things that I've found is that when we stick with a headset of how we've been trained about what sexuality is, we just think it's a block and we stick it in this place, which goes back to Danica's point about a scene with sex versus scenes with sex. I mean, a sex scene versus scenes with sex. You have the whole person, you have their experience, you have their sex history, you have all of these things. So your character that you're creating in the story that you're telling can be so wonderfully unique and specific, like sexuality, like sexual expression. It may start in chapter 1, but it's a weaving component of all of those things. So if someone has in their sex history that they have a fear of going to be tested, they don't even know how to do any of these things, it becomes a component of who they are. And we can just weave that right into the story. So it's not like, did I do this? Did I do this? Did I do this? Not just the points, but it becomes the person, which is my point about sexuality. It's holistic, it's physical, it's emotional, it's mental, it's spiritual. How do we as writers bring all of that forward with the details of life? Because I look at, how do I phrase this? Factually accurate, but realistically, there it is. This is how we have to present information so that people make those connection points.
I love that. Karen.
So we actually, several months ago, had a little workshop with Dr. J about these topics. And I have a book called I Want It That Way, which is coming out in May of 2023. And my idea of the book was that the main character wanted to get a tubal ligation because she'd grown up taking care of her siblings. And
wait a second. I just want a tubal ligation. So there's romance. Romance today talks about things like that.
Well, mine do.
Okay, go on, because I think for a lot of people this is like, wow, like we didn't, they're thinking like Fabio.
Well, I just happened to read an article about young women trying to get their tubes tied and who were refused by doctors because they were unmarried and under 30. And this is today. My book is set in the late 90s, but this is today. And I was so flabbergasted by that I started doing research. I started talking to other women. So I wanted to raise that as an issue that, we talk a lot about women's choice about their bodies, their reproductive health, but this is, and there are reasons. For a long time, tubal ligation was used against women's will. to sterilize them, but also it's an irreversible procedure. So you really do have to be sure. However, there are a lot of doctors who simply won't do it until a woman, again, is married and or over 30. And and the ways that many of these women report being treated are infantilizing. And I was upset about that. So I wanted to write about that. And in romance land, what you do is you have her ask a really hot guy to be her fake husband so that she can get it, and then problems ensue. But, spoiler alert, after talking to Dr. J and doing further research and writing my way into this character, I realized that her reasons for not wanting to get pregnant had a lot more to do with her fears around intimacy. And so what she thinks at the beginning of the book, what she finds out in the middle of the book as she gets to know her fake husband, and then where she is by the end of the book, is that she has to actually unpeel a lot of those emotional layers. She thinks once there's no fear of pregnancy, then I can go have sex and I'll have pleasure, because I can't right now. But what she learns is that she has to learn how to let somebody in, how to be emotionally vulnerable in order to have pleasure when having sex. And that's something I learned from both Dr. J and from reading Emily Nagasaki's book, Come As You Are, which is a fabulous book that everyone should read. So I think what's kind of cool about our community is that we are curious. We are willing to research and open our minds to things that we don't know about in order to take our characters and, along with our characters, our audiences on an emotional journey that also happens to have a sexual component to it.
I know we talked a little bit about shame, and we talked about how romance is downplayed as a women's fiction. How do you get more people reading these types of novels? Because they sound like multifaceted characters, but that there may be stereotypes and barriers that still exist. Danica.
Well, I'm not sure if I know how, but I mean, part of it is interesting to me. So I've been writing romance now, published for only 3 years. But when my friends found out that I was writing romance, the majority of them were like, oh, I don't read romance. Literally, I read smart things, right? They're accomplished women. But because they're my friends, they read my first book. And then without exception, they're like, this isn't what I expected a romance novel to be at all. There's a man in my community who is an advanced life support paramedic. And because my first book is about firefighters and first responders, he read it because he thought it would be fun, because he thought he'd recognize some of the characters in the book. He went on to read every single solitary one of my books. And because and he would come back to me and say, the stories are so rich. So I think part of getting more people to read romance, it's like, there are books I read that are like, people read women's fiction that have romantic plot lines in them, right? It's a languaging issue. It's definitely not a story issue.
But the publishing industry, which is still very cisgendered white male in its power structure. We have women's fiction. Do we have men's fiction? No, we do not. We have chick lit. Do we have bro lit? No, we do not. I think the problem is in our own messaging, that we are allowing ourselves to be told what to read. And the younger generation, you talked about how do we get them to be more open about it. I mean, if you just look at TikTok, the people on TikTok are getting the message out there for us. And we also have leg up from things like Bridgerton, Shonda Rhimes. She has elevated these kinds of stories. So I think a lot of it is getting out of our own way.
Wow, I love that, Lainey. I'd love
Yeah,
to hear
I
from
just
you.
want to hop in because it occurs to me, in all of our introductions, we used words like steamy to describe our romance. And, the three of us who are writing kind of serial genre romance like this, we say that in contrast to another type of romance, which is labeled clean and wholesome. And it's a huge discussion in the genre because steamy romance means that on the page, we see these characters come together in physical intimacy, and in clean and wholesome romance, that either doesn't exist in the plot or it is skipped over, or what is called fade to black. And I am so resentful of the notion that physical intimacy on the page is not wholesome or clean. So I don't quite know what the answer is, but I know that I don't have time in my life to read books that don't show the full spectrum of the human experience. And so I don't write them that way. Dr. J seems like she's going to explode.
Yeah, Lainey, I love what you said, Karen, Danica. I mean, this is the empowered women, and it's the empowered women that are going to bring all of the information about romance and sexuality full circle into a circle so that we have this encompassing direction of all of our different characters. And I think it's important that for me, and you talk about the how part, I'm kind of like romance novels, the new sex education, because that's my area. And how can I help it in multi levels? The readers, the writers, talk more about this, and having you address this from a health perspective, because the World Association for Sexuality just added pleasure as a definition of sexuality like only 3 years ago. So for us to even be able to say we can put pleasure in all of this and help people, have that experience through the storytelling within a romance novel.
I love that you talked about that, Dr. J. I do want to also talk about the fact that from a health perspective, the CDC often talks about the social determinants of health, right? And how they influence our ability to have health access and to engage in healthcare spaces. And when we think about sexuality and sex ed, for the most part, some of us receive sex ed and some of us don't. For those who don't receive sex ed, most of it comes from media, whether that be written or video or audio. And so what does that look like, especially for women, when you talk about consent, when you talk about contraceptives, when you talk about STIs, and where are we getting it from? So if we can see more holistic approaches that aren't just, one-sided, that's why I thought this was so important, because it is one of the big influencers on our human life, right? Our having sex, period, like how we engage in that. But it is the one thing that we are very afraid to talk about, at least in open spaces. We don't really talk about sex. We don't like when women have agency, right? Or talk about reproduction. So when I heard that romance was touching, like really approaching these subjects, I was like, wow, it has to be highlighted to the health community. Because when you say to kids, hey, I'm going to talk about sex ed, how much more fun would it be to read a steamy novel, right? And then say, let's talk about that. What happened in that book, as like a fun way to approach sex versus like, here's a picture of gonads and, all of the parts. Like, why can't we bring fiction into different ways to broach sex education? So educators out there who are listening, like, hey, maybe we do some of these novels that are out there. So,
Tahisha,
that could be an approach.
I have to jump in. We need to say clitoral body too, not just gonads.
And that's why you're the sex educator. But truly, like even myself at the age of 50, my education and intelligence around my own body is limited by, the things I remember from probably like sixth or seventh or eighth grade whenever we talked about those things. And then we never went back to it, really. So this has been such an amazing discussion. And I know that we could talk even deeper and more about this. How can listeners help? And how can they find your books and where you are? And I'm going to we'll go backwards. We'll start with Dr. J. And, how can listeners help and where can they find your stuff?
Well, I can use my basic website, has everything, drjauthor.com. I have a new project for women. So I've even heard authors saying that they are using this. It is called the Purple Sex Reflection Deck for Women. It encompasses 9 areas of sexuality. You can create layouts and do different things to investigate. I had somebody say they're incorporating this into their story, that they're using, the character is going to use the deck. So I was like, this is so fun. But that's where they can find me.
That's so awesome. Karen.
Dr. J, you have product placement. I love it. Awesome. Readers can find about me at karengray.com, and it's Gray, Grey. And how they can help, I'd really like to point out that a lot of the books that are being banned in this country in school libraries and in public libraries have to do with sex, have to do with gender, sexuality. I mean, honestly, my best sex ed when I was a kid was "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret" by Judy Blume.
Oh my gosh.
That book continues to be banned and is probably being rebanned these days. So finding out what's going on about that in your community, whether you have kids in a school or not, you have a right to go to the school board and talk about these kind of things. That is really important because if we want our kids to be able to learn about and see themselves represented and their desires and their needs represented in books, we got to get these bans stopped. We got to ban the bans.
I love that you mentioned that, Karen. Fantastic talking about banned books. Lainey.
My books are available wherever books are sold. I have audio as well. And my website is laineydavis.com, Lainey. And if I were to say a way that readers and listeners could help, it would be to read and, purchase a romance novel that's been written kind of recently. 3 of us have participated in charity anthologies that have raised money for reproductive access. The romance community is kind of famous for putting on these sorts of charity anthologies. So you can find groups of romance stories that when you purchase it, your money goes toward an important cause. Nora Roberts right now is raising money to, fight book banning. So there are a lot of ways that you can help by just buying and reading a romance book and then telling a friend.
Thank you so much for mentioning the anthologies. And finally, Danica.
And you can find me at danicabloom.com, Danica with a K. And I'm going to kind of jump on Lainey. If you are not sure you want to spend $5 yet on a romance book, Google Amazon romance bestsellers, and you will get a link. And on that page that comes up are all the 100 of the top free romances. And you can sort it by different types: romantic comedy, historical romance. You can see all the different fabulous subgenres. If you love historical fiction, pick up a historical romance. Get it for free on your e-reader and test it out and just see what you've been missing. See that it might not be your mama's romance. And, no risk to you. So that's what I would recommend that you do.
Or go to your library.
Exactly.
Your public library.
Support your libraries, yes.
And in person, you can borrow through Libby or Hoopla, because our books are all in libraries too.
Mm-hmm. And like, think of the subgenres. Like, I think that's one thing that we haven't covered here is romance is not a big, what is the word? It's not just a giant tower of the sameness. If you love sci-fi, there's alien romance. If you love historical, there's historical, like all the things, cowboys. if you love, watching Westerns, go read a Western romance.
Yes, Danica, thanks for pointing that out. Romance is not a monolith, right? It's
that's
like,
the word. Yes.
It is, there are many subgenres. It's very diverse. It's very inclusive. Thank you all for being here today. And if there is any link that you missed, we will also have it on the podcast page itself with a list of those lists and how to reach out to our authors and how to read their works. This has been such an informative session. I feel like now I want to go get a book and just sit down, but I still have to work this afternoon. I might get too excited. Thank you all for being here today. And as always, if you are looking for a interesting podcast that will always have some different information, please subscribe to our 52 Weeks of Health Equity podcast. And see you all next time. Bye.